myself have learned so much already. I know I will continue to. I'm also really excited to talk about how you can use museum exhibits and museum collections to sort of further the general public's and students' understanding of evolution. It's also very awkward for me to be up here and not talk at all about my own research. So if any of you ever want to know about insect evolution, insect genomics, or insect microbiomes, happy to talk about that. So first, I think it's important to talk about what are the origins of natural history museums. They first sort of came about as these cabinets of curiosities, right? These Kunststammers, and they originated in Europe. And what these sort of cabinets were these rooms that served not only as collections of the artifacts and the specimens that a particular quote-unquote curator was interested in, but they actually were used as social devices. They were to establish and uphold rank. But at the same time, they were also considered learned entertainment. So even back then, people recognized that while they were fun and they were engaging, you still could learn from these collections. But where did these curiosities that filled these cabinets come from? And these often came from these traveling naturalists who traveled the world and brought specimens or shipped specimens back to be sold to wealthy patrons and to museums. And in fact, I think it's pretty fitting that two of the sort of most influential people in evolutionary biology, Alfred Russel Wallace and Henry Walter Bates, actually did in fact do this. They traveled the world, they shipped specimens back, and they were using the funds they were making during these expeditions to fund their own opportunities to travel the world. But these traveling naturalists were not always sort of using this material to sell back to others. Some were even what were called learned scholars as these early explorers. And so Charles Darwin is a perfect example of this. And so we see these well-educated and wealthy men also going on these expeditions, often joining these fleets of ships that were traveling the world to do surveying so that they could grow their own quote-unquote scientific collections, and in some cases also donate or give those to museums. So of course, I think it's pretty interesting that one of the people who two of the people who sort of formulated the idea of natural selection and evolution actually began by going out and collecting specimens to bring back to actually learn from and give to museums. And so clearly we've made a lot of advances in understanding the theory of evolution through the lens of these collections. But again, I want to remind you that really it was this partnership independently that both Darwin and Wallace arrived at the same conclusion by being out in the natural world and seeing nature at its sort of fundamental diversity and examining those specimens and then deriving this very influential theory. But of course, museums have evolved. I've spent my entire career inside of natural history collections, from my undergrad through my PhD, through my postdoc. My first job was actually at the Field Museum. I'm now the director and head curator of the Cornell University Insects Collection, which has 7 million specimens. So I believe deeply that we have a lot to learn, both scientifically, but it's our obligation to use those to help educate the public. And so I actually went to Wikipedia and said, well, what is a natural history museum? And I really liked these definitions. The primary role of natural history museum is to provide the scientific community with the current and historical specimens for their research, which is to improve our understanding of the natural world. And I think a lot of people forget that the holdings within a natural history museum, the majority of which are not on display. But, as they also note, some museums do have public exhibits to share the beauty and wonder of the natural world with the public, and these are often referred to as public museums. Now, I want to be clear, some collections have no public interface, some only have a public interface and have very few specimens behind the scene, but most are actually both. They're massive research institutions as well as these educators of the public. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about how they've influenced scientific research, but I'll spend the majority of the time talking about on exhibits and education and round out with a couple of conclusions. So museum specimens and collections are fundamental to our understanding of evolutionary biology and biodiversity. And I think part of the reason that they're so powerful is that many of those specimens that are held in the museums across the globe, they're going to be impossible to recollect. There's several reasons, one of which destructions of habitats. There are places that just don't exist anymore. And I know when I say that, at least for myself and for many people I know, you tend to think of these beautiful intact rainforests which have been plowed down so that local people can make a living. But I would argue that it's not just in far-flung places. It's in our own backyards. We all have parking lots where that habitat has disappeared. We know that we have transformed, even in North America, habitats entirely from native grasslands to forests that never existed. And so with that, we are losing biodiversity, or at least we're losing our understanding of how it may have evolved through time. But we can go into those collections and look at what still remains. We also know that species go extinct, and we also see population losses. So in some cases, museums are the only way we're going to be able to look at what has happened or changed through time. There can be prohibitive costs for revisiting some locations, as well as in some cases it's actually unsafe to visit those locations. It could be due to things like war or conflicts. And of course, there are shifting collecting and export policies that are dictating this, and this is actually a good thing. As someone who's had to navigate all of the intricacies of trying to collect in places, I know how important that is, because what we're trying to do is allow people to invest and protect their own biodiversity resources. So what exactly have museum specimens taught us? One of which they've taught us a lot about anatomy and variation. And I think that typically that's what people think of when they think of museum collections. They think of a taxonomist, someone who's going in and carefully measuring parts of the body to then describe species and maybe say something about that variation. But in addition, we know that we can use these museum specimens to study things like convergence, as we heard about, right? How many times have these things evolved? All of the information on those labels has turned out to be way more important than anybody had appreciated when they were first writing that information down. It's helping us understand the impacts of climate change in real time. It's helping us understand how species are moving through landscapes, who's not able to move. It's also telling us about where the origin of invasive species are. We can even do predictive modeling about where we expect species to be able to expand based on where they were historically. With emerging technologies, we've become more and more able to use genetics and genomics to ask questions about species from museum collections. And this has really unlocked our understanding of the biological world. And more, we can even turn to museum specimens to understand things about the microbiome, or essentially how every single organism is essentially a walking around tropical rainforest with things living in and on us. And that tells us something about whether they might be able to be successful in the future, what might have led to their demise, why some species are so resilient, and in some cases we can even use that to farm natural products. So museum collections are significantly used in research, and what I'm going to do is, I work at the Cornell University Insect Collection. I'm going to give you 3 examples just from our own collection, and you can talk to any museum scientist and they will give you a list as long as your arm. So this is a study that we did where we actually sequenced the genome of an extinct butterfly, the Xerces blue butterfly. And what we were able to demonstrate that this butterfly actually went extinct, which we already knew, but that it was at the hands of humans. I mean, it was because of habitat conversion in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, that's not what the genomics allowed us to test. But what the genomics allowed us to test was this long-standing question whether the Xerces blue butterfly was in fact a distinct species, or was it just a population of a widespread species that has its distribution from Canada through all of California into northern Mexico? And people had long argued as to which in fact was true. So by going in and sequencing the genome of this extinct species, which could only be studied from going into a museum collection, we were able to demonstrate not only was it an extinct species, it wasn't even a population or closely related to that widespread thing. It's actually more closely related to other little species that have very blinking small habitats and are isolated as well, suggesting that we might have other species that are on the brink of also going extinct. This is some work by a colleague of mine, Brian Danforth, where they've been doing a long-term study of the native pollinators in New York State. And what's so impactful is they've been collecting pollinators through time. And by surveying those pollinators through time, what they've been able to demonstrate is that we're seeing a decrease in those native pollinators and that we're losing the pollination services. And this could only be done through that repeated collecting of these pollinators. And the last study I particularly like, because I think most people think museum collections are really only helpful to biologists. And this is a collaboration between the collections manager who I work with and material scientists at Cornell. And the material scientists came to the insect collection and said, hey, we have a question. why doesn't an insect shatter when a drop of rain hits it? Because if a drop of water of the same velocity and shape were to hit us, it would crush us. So why doesn't it happen? And we were like, well, we don't know. So they said, can we take some dead bugs and bounce some water off of it? We're like, sure. And so we gave them a bunch of specimens, and what they were able to demonstrate is that all insects over their entire bodies, which are very hard to see, have this microstructure all over. So when that raindrop hits them, before it's even touched their body, it's already been shattered into 1 million tiny droplets, so that the size of a droplet hitting an insect is no different than the size of a raindrop hitting us. They're now using that to build better materials like things for airplanes, where you need aerodynamics, you need things to sort of shatter and flood off without actually disrupting the material. So last I'll finish out talking about how museum exhibits can be so influential in education. So first I want to start with a little definition of informal education and what we know from people going into natural history museums and surveying guests before and after they visit these collections. And I'm going to show you a montage of papers, and I'm not going to talk about them right now, just to establish the fact that there are experts who go in and assess whether these museum collections are efficient and good at helping change visitors' views. And these are all around evolution. And what you'll notice is that there's a lot of robust literature that's coming out trying to understand how do we walk through a museum collection and what is it that we take away once we're done. I will revisit 2 of these studies near the end to talk about what they actually find. So informal education in museums can actually come in lots of forms. And I think that's one of the things I want to sort of amplify. Is that all of us can be doing it, even if we're not necessarily associated with a museum collection. And so this is a great sort of graph that helps us understand that. So we have these museum educators and staff who are interacting with visitors to understand what their interests are, where the gaps in their knowledge are, and what are the sort of ways in which we can leverage informal learning to then partner with the museum exhibits and design folks who are also experts in their field. So we're now seeing that lots of natural history museums not just have scientists, they have museum educators that are experts in their field. We have museum design and exhibit development folks who are experts in their field. They're then creating those exhibits that it's an iterative process back and forth with the visitors. The visitors are telling them like what they're learning, what are the perceptions, what is maybe not working well. At the same time, we're leveraging that information to inform those exhibits and make them even more robust, with the idea that when they come out of the museum experience, they've actually gained a lot of knowledge. So museums often use these diverse tools through things like these public interactions that happen through videos, through blogs, through presentations, and hands-on experiences. Those museum professional educators also develop tools that go straight into the hands of educators in the K through 12 classroom. And then, of course, we've sort of already alluded to it, that we build these museum exhibits that are supposed to be fun, but also educational. So one of the ways that we do it are through these things called Meet a Scientist event. And I think that this is really important because people want to engage not only with the real things, the real artifacts, the real specimens, they want to meet real scientists. And I think that, this idea of you can't be it if you can't see it is really fundamentally important. People don't realize that scientists look like us. If you Google what does a scientist look like, or if you use AI to generate what does a scientist look like, it looks like nobody in this room. And we don't have to wear lab coats, And so I think that making us accessible is just as important as making the stuff accessible. And so it's really a great way to share that there's lots of things going on behind the scenes. There's specimens behind the scenes, there's scientists behind the scenes. But it's also a great way to empower trainees to have an opportunity to engage with the public so that the public can see people who are of the same age group as them often, but it's also a way to empower visitors to feel like they're part of the conversation. There's also lots of ways in which you can use multimedia. Videos are a really great way. You heard earlier about using magazine articles to share your work. These are 2 videos that I partook in, and one is with the Brains Group and Emily Grassley. That's had over 2 million views. I guarantee you I will never hit that with citations. As well as I've partnered with PBS on their Eons episode where they highlighted 3 of my papers to sort of tell a story about ants and plants diversifying. And so, I think often I talk to scientists and they're very leery to talk to reporters or to talk to people who are doing this kind of work because they're so afraid they're going to misspeak. And I will tell you right now, if I watch either of these, I cringe every time because I'm like, oh, that's not exactly how I would have said it, But that doesn't matter. No one knows that except me and maybe like 10 other ant biologists. The public is excited. They're engaging with this material. Another way to do it are things like blogs or partnering with these opportunities and other media outlets. And I think these are really great because it lets us do a little dictating on what we want to write about and sort of what is the audience we're trying to target. We've done things through things like Frontiers in Young Minds. We published a paper on how museums are important to audiences that are below the 12th grade. And if you haven't published with that outlet, I highly recommend it because what's so great is you identify the grade band you want to have this reach. They then invite a high school or a middle school teacher to be one of the reviewers along with two students of that age group. So your reviews are so more thoughtful and helpful than often the regular peer review process. But there are lots of ways to reach out to folks. And if you're not necessarily comfortable starting your own blog, I don't have the time, nor do I have the interest, but I've done guest blogging, right? So finding ways to get our work out in many different shapes and forms. We've also partnered with people who create things like video games. If you know ways to do that, of course, that's also a fantastic way. But really, I want to spend a little time talking about how we teach evolution through museum exhibits. One, we have these standalone museum exhibits, right? And I think those are very powerful. But as we've already heard, if people are walking in with their own biases, they may opt to not walk through that exhibit. And so we have to recognize, are there other ways that we can get them to understand the evolutionary process and how we get to those conclusions? And that's through including evolution into other exhibits as well. So I'll give you a few examples. This is one where we just recently partnered with the Museum of Earth in Ithaca, New York, where we created an exhibit all about insects with lots of hands-on activities. What you're seeing there is we took one of our museum cases and mounted it to the floor right in the public space, had the drawers that only could pull halfway out so people could feel like they were entomology curators. But we peppered throughout it how insects evolve, how climate change is impacting insect diversity. And so we wanted to make sure that although it was a fun exhibit engaging people in sort of the most diverse group of animals on the planet, but along with it, they were learning these core principles. And I think that people often forget that, real scientists work at museums, that there's really, science happening behind the scenes. And so it's important to open up those spaces and give people an opportunity to engage. An exhibit that we opened was called The Romance of Ants. And this was a really fun exhibit for me. And because I'm an ant biologist, sorry, maybe I should have shared that. And what we did is we created this massive live ant farm. That thing's probably about this big. We have live ants and doing their thing, but we also had live videos. We had larger than life photographs of ants, all kinds of information about ant biology, but also how ants evolved and sort of their family tree. But then we also used a cartoon narrative to tell the story. And so essentially through a graphic novel, people got to understand how I went through my career. I'm sorry, it seems to be a bit out of order, apologies, where you could walk through from me as a very small child how I got interested in bugs and science all the way through becoming a scientist. I will tell you that I was very nervous about being turned into a cartoon. Maybe not surprising. But the impact it had with the visitors who came, that we still have the graphic novel freely available. The number of people who've reached out to me about that was tremendous. I will also share that I had one of my senior colleagues once say to me that I had undermined the rigor of science and the reputation of scientists by doing this. And so I think that we have our own work to do, not just with the public, even with some of our own colleagues, and how we make the work we do approachable. And so that's just another scene from it where you can sort of see how we were able to pull this off. I have to go back, apologies. And so museum specimens and exhibits are just so successful because I think fundamentally they're telling stories. And I know that there's some pushback in the scientific community that we shouldn't tell stories. And actually, Sean Carroll and I were talking about how we say, oh, it's narratives. Like, why is telling a story a bad thing? I mean, I think why almost all of us got interested in this was because we spent time out in nature, and that's what pulled us in. So why don't we lean into the storytelling component? I think another reason that museums are so successful at sort of telling engaging research is that they're always mission driven. They have one focus and they sort of are sticking to that line, and then they're pulling in the exhibits and the people to help drive that narrative. They're very visitor focused, right? And so instead of it being like, I'm a talking head and I'm going to talk to you in my jargon and tell you how to do it, it's actually flipped the discourse on sort of how we have to present the material. And really, again, it's being able to interact with the real thing. And so, the Romance of Ants was actually open for about 2.5 years, and we had over 500,000 people go through that tiny exhibit. And I could never have imagined that. The other thing is that, our education team did surveys of guests before and after to understand what they learned along the way, both from the scientific standpoint, but also through these summative evaluations. But my favorite quote was someone said at the end of going through the exhibit that being a science nerd is perfectly fine, which I thought that was a huge win for me. But alongside that, one of the things we did is we created some educational materials that we then were able to send to K through 12 educators. We sent them to almost 400 K through 12 educators in Southern Florida, since I had been doing an NSF-funded project in the Florida Keys, as well as to teachers in the Chicago area with a focus on public schools. Now, it's great to get a poster, but a teacher often doesn't know what to do with that, which is why it was so important to partner with our science educators, because we created a worksheet that went along with it so that they knew how to then incorporate in that classroom. And so what they did is they took pieces of it and broke it out and applied it to the next generation science standards and told teachers how you could incorporate pieces of this directly into the curriculum that they have to deliver in their classrooms. And so I've already mentioned this exhibit. It was in this Museum of Science exhibit where we had the drawers open available. That was open for about 9 months, and we had almost 20,000 people visit that. So again, these are ways that our work, and we actually featured real scientists by myself as well as other members of our entomology department right in the exhibit, and that has far more impact than probably most of my publications. We created an online version which is still freely available where you can walk through all of the content of the exhibit. Because it was funded partially by the National Science Foundation, they actually picked it up and amplified our work through several of their outlets. Was a really great way to sort of demonstrate to NSF that their contributions to broader impacts have this big piece, that they don't always see that connection. And one of the things I heard from the program officers is, they often get this dry report at the end, but if you are doing things, just popping it off and sharing it, I sent them pictures of the exhibit, they were like, this is what we really want. I've even found a way to include evolutionary content into exhibit spaces you might not have thought of. And so this is where we partnered with the Johnson Museum of Art, because they were doing an exhibit on Piney the Elder, who was one of the first naturalists sort of to, describe the natural world. And so we thought, hey, we can include things like an insect phylogeny in the exhibit, all used on the very left where we used insects to sort of draw the tree of life, as well as talk about biological diversity. Another exhibit that we just recently opened was called From Nabokov's Net, and that is because Vladimir Nabokov, who many people know as a literary writer, he actually was a professor of Russian literature at Cornell. But he was also a massive butterfly collector and amateur butterfly scientist. So while he was at Cornell, he spent every summer collecting butterflies and then donated them to our museum. But what people don't realize often is that Vladimir Nabokov made fundamental, important contributions to our understanding of butterfly biogeography, and that's what we actually focused on. We didn't talk about his literature at all. We actually focused entirely on his science. And so as part of that, he had hypothesized, he studies this group of butterflies called the blues. By examining specimens both in his native Russia, Europe when he lived there, and in North America, but also specimens from South America, he had formulated a hypothesis about how those butterflies had spread across the globe. So Nomi Pierce and her team at Harvard University several years ago went in and used DNA to test all of his hypotheses, and he actually had these waves of predictions. And it turns out every single one of them was correct, even in the correct order. And so we were able to talk about how someone who just from studying the internal and external anatomy of these specimens could formulate these hypotheses, which we could then, now use modern methods to test and show that it was in fact true. And it was a great way to engage with alumni, with other organizations just by chance. The Lepidoptera Society had their annual meeting at Cornell when we had the exhibit open. And even more surprising is there's an International Nabokov Society Society that came to Cornell while the exhibit was opened. And those are people who are much more interested in his literature, but got a window into the science and were just really interested. So the other thing I wanted to highlight is that, I think we've heard it over and over again, is that evolution and religion do not need to be in conflict. So this is a photograph I took when I just recently went to Brigham Young University and got to visit their natural history collection on campus. And I really loved that right away in the museum, they took an opportunity to talk about how there's knowing by faith and knowing by science, and that they don't have to be in conflict. And I really appreciated this because I think that one of the mistakes we made, and we've heard about it all, we have our confirmation bias and our own preconceived ideas, is that we'll make assumptions as evolutionary biologists about the relationship between people who have faith and people who don't. And I think that's a blind spot on our side that we all probably need to work on, many of us, not all of us. But also, I loved that just right up front, this Natural History Museum decided to integrate it straight into the exhibit space. So let's go back to that informal education literature, and I want to walk you through two studies and sort of what they found. So in this paper, the predictors of evolutionary acceptance in a museum population, what they were able to show, and so they used this thing called the MATE score, which was not formulated by them, but is often used in informal education, which is this measure of the acceptance of the theory of evolution. And first they looked at it at educational attainment level. And what you'll find, and maybe not surprising, is that the more highly educated you are, the more likely you are to score high on this MATE score. But interestingly, when we look at religious affiliations, we actually see a lot of variation among who is more likely to accept the theory of evolution. And we see that the individuals who are Catholic and Protestants are sort of moderate, those that are non-denominational score quite low, and that those that are in the other or none category and other are Muslims, Hindus, and Jews are actually scoring quite high on their acceptance of the theory of evolution. And it's also correlated with church attendance, regardless of your religious affiliation, that the more frequently you're attending church, the less likely you are to accept the theory of evolution. And now I think that that's not necessarily a result of the religious attendance, but something about our ability to get into those communities to be able to share what actually is the theory of natural selection and evolution. So I want to walk you through one more study, and this one is on changing museum visitors' concepts of evolution. And what they found was that whatever their age, their background beliefs, and this includes religious beliefs, or prior intuitive reasoning patterns, and this looked at things like whether they were more likely to believe in intelligent design or in the theory of evolution or be quite agnostic about it, that visitors significantly increased their use of explanations from the evolutionary reasoning pattern across all measures and extended this reasoning to other diverse organisms. So they had used 5 different model groups to tell stories, and then what they asked them is for things even outside of that. In addition, they found that visitors who initially endorsed the creationist intelligent design explanation changed as much, if not more, because they had more room to grow, that's the author's own quotes, than visitors who were already sympathetic to evolutionary ideas. So what you see is that when you have an opportunity to engage with these individuals and share actually what are the information that we have around the natural world and how it's evolved, we can increase acceptance of these ideas. So in conclusion, I hope that I've convinced you that museums are incredibly important places for both evolutionary research, but also for an opportunity for educating the public. And I would say that now in this time that we're currently in, where we're seeing an assault on higher education, we're seeing an assault on education, we're seeing an assault on science, that it's all of our obligations to make sure that we're out helping inform the public. We have to be innovative and creative and lean into storytelling. We should team up with others that have been successful who are the experts in what they do. If you want to create content that's going to go into the K through 12 classroom and you're not an educator who's already trained in that, make sure you partner with somebody because it has to align with the curriculum that they're required to follow in their own classrooms. I know a lot of scientists who are like, I created all this great content, I posted it on a website. I will tell you, no, K through 12 teachers ever used it because it probably doesn't conform to their learning standards, but also they don't know how to incorporate it. And so that's why it's so important to partner with them. Empower your trainees and other colleagues into doing this work and really try to use any opportunity you can to share your science, even if it's just standing in line at the grocery store. And lastly, I would say I'd really want to give a call to everyone should really lean in and support natural history museums. Even if you don't use specimens in your own work, even if you don't work at a natural history museum, because they're often the first hit when there are budget cuts. They are responsible for educating millions of visitors every year. They're often the leaders in informal education. They have staff there that are experts in this work and actually are doing the work to understand how these methods are changing the minds of visitors. They often have active researchers on site who also need all of our support. And that these are these biorepositories of all of the diversity of life. And in some cases, the only way we'll ever be able to study is by going behind the scenes in these museum collections and looking at their resources. And that they are resources from people in any scientific field, and that we all benefit from these biological collections. So with that, I'll take questions if there's time.